Welcome to Dead Talk Stories, where we accept video submissions from people who want to share their story around death. Today we have Katie, who lost her father, who lets us in on her grief journey and what it was like to accept the fact that her father decided it was his time to die. Please wait until the end and join me on an episodic recap where I share my thoughts on today's episode. Enjoy.
His teeth saying, I want to go. Like, please let me go. Like, I want to die. And some days I'm okay, and some days I'm really not. I just felt so grateful for that whole experience. Grief smacked me in the face about 3 years after my dad passed. My story involves my dad. He passed away 7 years ago, and he passed away from liver and kidney failure. When my dad was younger, he had a back surgery and needed a blood transfusion, and that blood transfusion contained hepatitis C, which is a blood infection that can cause liver cirrhosis, liver failure, if it goes unnoticed or untreated for a long time. And when my dad received this blood transfusion, it was at a time when either hospitals or this hospital was not testing blood for hepatitis C. So my dad and I think 8 other people ended up receiving hepatitis C from these blood transfusions because they weren't testing for it. And it got to a point where it was pretty severe with my dad. He needed a liver transplant when I was 8, and it was pretty serious. He only had a few days to live at that point, and he was lucky enough that they found a match and he was able to get a liver and survived that transplant. But they told him that he would only live about 10 years after that before he would need another liver transplant or have to be put on dialysis to continue living. And so for the most part, those 10 years were okay to a degree. My dad definitely had some limitations when it came to his health and was on a lot of medicine and couldn't necessarily, play football or go hiking. And my parents were also divorced, so any sort of caretaking, help, doctor's appointments, all of that. My brother and I had to help my dad out in that aspect. And after those 10 years, my dad's health started to decline fairly steadily. So when I was a senior in high school, freshman in college, his health started to steadily decline. And over the next 5 to 6 years, he almost died a few times from different infections. He had a tumor, he had a stroke. His kidneys were failing at a much faster rate than before. And so the solution there was to have another liver and kidney transplant. But since he was in his 60s and older and had already gone through one transplant, the likelihood of him surviving that surgery was very low. And so basically put him on dialysis, which is a process, like this machine kind of filters your blood. It removes the toxins from your blood because your kidneys and liver aren't able to do that. And so that was essentially the only thing keeping him alive, and he did that for 5 years. And towards the end, when his health really started to decline and his standard of living was extremely low, he couldn't walk, he couldn't bathe himself. It's not like we could go out to dinner, anything like that. He was in a nursing home for the last 2 or 3 years of his life. My brother and I were in our early 20s, and we were unable to take care of my dad the way he needed to be taken care of. And so he was in a nursing home for a couple of years. And towards the end, his standard of living was just so low. He started to be in a lot of pain. And my dad had a very high pain tolerance. And so when my dad was saying that he was in pain, that's how we knew it was getting pretty bad. And I went with him to his last dialysis appointment, and he was squeezing my hand and gritting his teeth saying, I want to go. Like, please let me go. Like, I want to die. Like, I can't do this anymore. And I was like, you've got it. Like, this is probably the best case scenario with him. He was as sound of mind as he was ever going to be. And for him to make that decision to die was the best, because the alternative was him being so sick and put on life support. And then my brother and I would have to decide when to take him off of life support. And I know that that's something that I probably wouldn't have been able to do, and wouldn't want the responsibility, and wouldn't want my brother to deal with that either. It's just not ideal. And so my dad essentially asked to be taken off of dialysis, and that's what happened. basically tell the dialysis center that he won't be coming back, and they set him up in the nursing home on a morphine drip. And they said, he'll have a few days to a week, but he will pass away fairly quickly. And that's what happened. I think he lasted 3 or 4 days. And we spent the last night with him, but he was pretty out of it and just kept saying, let me go, I want to go. And that next morning they called us and told us that he passed away. And what I really didn't expect to feel was relief. And it was just such a long, hard road. It was like 15 years of my dad being okay and being sick and almost dying. And it was very stressful, and just a lot happened in those 15 years. And I was so prepared for it, and I knew it was going to happen. I grew up knowing that my dad wasn't going to live very long. He was open about not knowing if he would see his kids graduate from high school or college, and he was able to see both. But I just knew that he would, he probably wouldn't be at my wedding. He probably wouldn't meet my kids. And I just felt so prepared. And so when it happened, I felt relief because he had suffered for so long and was in so much pain that he was finally at peace, and I didn't have to worry about him. And I remember being in the nursing home and people were crying, and I wasn't crying. I just was, relieved, which is very weird to say. And the feeling of relief and how he got to pass away, I knew it was going to happen. I felt prepared for it. I got to tell him everything I wanted to tell him at that time. I got to say goodbye. And I just felt so grateful for that whole experience and him not being in pain, that those feelings really carried me for 2 or 3 years. And I honestly thought that I was okay. I was like, I don't need to go to therapy. I think I'm okay. I feel grateful. I feel like I can start my life and all of those things. And then grief smacked me in the face about 3 years after my dad passed away. And I never dealt with anxiety when I was younger, which is kind of wild to me now, everything I went through, that I didn't really experience that when I was younger. But I think it was because I was in pretty intense survival mode and there wasn't a lot of room to be anxious, but I don't know. Anyway, so I became incredibly anxious and insecure and fearful and confused and lost because I was starting to really feel his absence. And I had an incredible relationship with my dad. So that's the other side of it, is he was the best dad I could have ever asked for. He was my best friend, and he just really was, it's like the dad that people dream about. He told me he loved me all of the time. He went to every basketball game, track meet, choir concert, and he was a single parent and still managed to just be like the best. And he was dealing with his illness, and he was just the best dad ever. So that absence, having something that great and losing it, and then starting to feel that absence, is when I started to experience that grief, since I didn't go to therapy and I didn't process those feelings, and I just kind of thought that I was okay because I felt the relief. And yeah, anxiety, always kind of dealt with depression, but that got worse, and I was really irritable and angry. And I just thought at the time that I didn't like my job and I just needed a new job. And I would drive home from work most days and just sob. And it got to a point where I was like, there's is something else, and realized and learned that it was grief. And worked through that to some degree in therapy. I still feel like I have work to do in that regard, and I am not good at articulating my pain or grief. I think that grief is a really weird, tricky thing, and I miss my dad every day, and some days I'm okay and some days I'm really not. And it's been 7 years, and it's obviously no one's expecting you to just magically be okay one day, but I think that some people might think that if you're really not doing okay and it's been so long, that there might be something wrong with that. I don't know. Who cares what people think? But trying to talk about grief is hard. And I think I've just realized that it's something that I'll always have to deal with and carry. And some days it's too much and I don't want to deal with it, and it's too heavy and it's too dark, and I don't like it. I don't want to sit with it, and I wish it wasn't a part of my life. But I think one of the biggest things the whole thing has taught me, a huge example of this lesson, is that I can't control everything, and I can't control most things. Like, the most important person in my life was taken away from me, and I couldn't do anything about it. And it's something I have to live with for the rest of my life. And there is a sense of peace and relief when you truly come to terms with that. And it's just like every day I'm pretty much reminded of that, and try to, come to terms with that, and just really know that I can't control everything, and things are going to happen to me, and the only thing I can do is, control how I react to it, and control how I deal with my emotions, and how I seek out help, and how therapy has helped me, and just talking to people about it, listening to podcasts about other people's stories, and feeling less alone. So, and another thing that I think I've learned is just something that I'm really thankful for, and especially with how my dad lived his life and everything he went through, and just learning at a really young age what really matters in life, and your relationships with people, and how you show up for them, and how you love people and love yourself, and just all about your family and your relationships. And I feel really fortunate that I had that insight when I was younger, and feel like I'm so hyper aware. It made me so incredibly empathetic, that I'm so aware of my own emotions, and I'm so aware of other people's emotions, and I take them on, and that can definitely be a superpower. It can also be a problem. But just being incredibly empathetic and loving, and not being afraid to be there for people, and love them, and be hyper aware of how precious people are, and you never know. And it's cliche, life is precious, but it really is when you lose the most important person in your life. And especially at a younger age, losing a parent is just a really weird, very weird situation. So I could go on and on and on about certain things, but I guess that's the gist of it. So yeah, thank you if you watch this, thank you for watching this and being patient with me as I got through that. And again, I just want to thank you for what you're doing and allowing people to share their story. And I'm a big podcast person, and I look forward to keep listening. So thank you.
Thank you all for watching that with me. And Katie, I want to thank you for submitting your story. It's a different way of doing it when the camera's on you, I'm sure, and no one's asking you questions. So I think you did that beautifully. And I think it's really important what you tapped into in regards to feeling that relief. I've spoke to my fair share of people that feel that relief when they're witnessing, day by day, month by month, year by year, the person that they love declining with the inevitable moment of death, which it seemed like you explained. And to feel that relief, I haven't experienced that. But I mean, it makes sense to me when you're seeing the person that's so important to you suffering and continuing to battle on like that. I could see how relief would be a prominent feeling. And, without understanding that feeling myself, I've also heard other people feel guilt with that. But, I think however you feel and whatever you feel is natural, and, it's okay to feel what you feel. So I appreciate you, admitting and being vulnerable enough to say you felt relief, because I think that's a really brave thing to do. And as you mentioned, grief is tricky. It's a son of a bitch, in other words. And it's wild to me when you hear stories like yours that said you really felt smacked in the face with the grief 3 years later when you thought everything was good. And that's so quintessential to what grief is sometimes. It doesn't make sense. The timing's off. It's not linear. It's a grief continuum, as one of my guests, Phil Cohen, says. Sometimes it's forward, sometimes it's back. It's kind of like a living organism, and it just hits you when you don't expect it sometimes. And you mentioned you're 7 years in, and I'm sure you're going to have plenty of evolving to do. So I'm really happy you submitted your story. I'm really happy I got a chance to watch it and hear from you. Maybe this isn't the last time we hear from you, and I want to thank you again for being part of this story submission, being part of this podcast, because without people like you willing to share your story, this isn't even a thing. So thank you so much. And for anyone that made it to the end of this video and that watched this with me, please send your love in the comments to Katie. And for anyone else that has a story that they might want to share, please submit it. I'll try to take a look at as many as I can and try to get as many stories as I can out there. And at the end of the day, I might be doing what you're doing. I'm just talking to a camera. No one's around me, and it feels pretty good. So I hope you get the opportunity to submit your story like Katie did. And once again, thank you all so much for being here. As always, for more content, please subscribe. I don't like saying that, but hey, it's the way we get more stories out there. So once again, David with Dead Talks. Until next time.